It's happening, and it's the kind of move that can change the math for millions of Americans in a very real way. Congress has passed a new bill connected to Social Security, and it includes provisions that can deliver extra money for certain beneficiaries as early as the next benefit cycle. Now, watch this. When you live on a fixed income, a small change is rarely small. It can decide whether essentials fit inside a monthly budget or spill over into stressful trade-offs. So let's unpack what lawmakers say this shift is meant to do, why they argue it is necessary, how it could influence monthly checks, and what people receiving Social Security retirement benefits, supplemental security income, disability benefits, or survivor payments should monitor as the plan moves from paper to payment. Over the past several years, financial pressure on retirees has steadily intensified, with higher costs showing up across groceries, housing, prescription medications, utilities, and transportation. And many seniors say their monthly checks simply do not stretch the way they used to. Lawmakers from both parties hear those concerns repeatedly through town halls, letters, and policy meetings. And even though arguments about federal spending can turn complicated and contentious, one point often draws broad agreement. Older Americans deserve predictability after decades of paying into the system. The bill that just cleared Congress is the product of months of negotiation, with legislators reviewing economic data, inflation patterns, healthcare costs, and long-term projections for retirement security, all while trying to deliver near-term help without destabilizing the long-term structure of Social Security. What most people miss is that policymakers worry as much about confusion as they do about cost. Sudden or poorly designed changes can scramble expectations. So much of the discussion centers on clarity, stability, and support that is targeted instead of chaotic. At its core, the legislation takes aim at two big issues retirees talk about constantly: keeping benefits aligned with real-world expenses and responding quickly when financial conditions shift faster than expected. Annual adjustments already exist to help benefits track inflation, but supporters argue there are moments when an extra step is justified, and they position this vote as one of those moments. So what does it actually mean when people say Congress passed a Social Security bill that includes an extra payment? In plain terms, the legislation authorizes a supplemental financial boost designed to reach qualifying beneficiaries without forcing them into a complicated application process, with the emphasis on efficiency so payments can move through existing infrastructure rather than getting stuck behind new paperwork and avoidable delays. Of course, the instant anyone hears extra payment, the practical questions hit fast. How large could it be? When might it arrive? Does it change the regular monthly benefit? And, most importantly, who qualifies? Administrative agencies still handle the technical rollout, but lawmakers have already put out guidance intended to reduce misunderstandings, and one reassuring point is repeated. Regular Social Security payments are not being replaced or reduced. Instead, the additional payment is built as an add-on, not a swap. And that distinction matters because beneficiaries plan their lives around predictable deposit schedules. Financial planners often underline that consistency is one of Social Security's greatest strengths because it lets households budget with confidence rather than constantly recalculating what can be paid and what must be postponed. To understand why this bill gains momentum, it helps to zoom out to the broader economic picture. Even when inflation cools after a period of rapid increases, prices rarely drop back to old levels and instead settle into a higher baseline that keeps squeezing purchasing power long after the headlines move on. Lawmakers cite that reality repeatedly, pointing out that retirees often have fewer chances to boost income than working-age adults. So when costs rise, the pressure lands harder and lasts longer. Healthcare costs play an especially powerful role in shaping this legislation because medical spending tends to rise with age, and unexpected expenses can derail even the most carefully planned budget. Policymakers hear from retirees who describe delaying procedures, stretching medications, or cutting back on essentials just to stay within budget, and those lived experiences reinforce the urgency behind the measure. Another driver of support is a blunt recognition. Social Security is not just a government program on paper. For millions of households, it functions as the foundation of retirement income, and for some, it represents most of their monthly resources. When purchasing power weakens, the effects ripple through daily life, nutrition choices, housing decisions, and overall well-being, so supporters frame the extra funds as both practical and preventative. The argument is that by helping seniors cover needs now, the government may reduce the risk of deeper hardship later, and preventative policy may not look dramatic, but it can be as important as emergency action when it keeps small problems from turning into crises. Timing is usually the first thing people focus on, and while agencies still need to coordinate distribution, the intention behind the legislation is speed, because financial relief is most helpful when it arrives without prolonged uncertainty. The expectation is that the current payment system is used wherever possible, sending funds through familiar channels to minimize confusion when millions of payments are involved. If benefits are already received by direct deposit, the extra payment is generally expected to follow the same route. And for those who receive paper checks, the process is intended to mirror the established method as closely as possible. Consistency is the theme here. Less confusion, fewer errors, and less opportunity for bad actors to exploit uncertainty. And yes, whenever a new payment is announced, misinformation can spread quickly, so experts are already urging beneficiaries to be cautious about unsolicited calls, emails, or messages claiming they can speed things up. In most cases, legitimate payments tied to federal programs do not require surprise enrollment steps or fees, so staying patient and relying on official information is often the strongest protection against scams. Now let's widen the lens on eligibility. Even though the final administrative details always matter, lawmakers design this measure with the goal of reaching people who depend most heavily on Social Security income, including many retirees, individuals receiving disability benefits, and survivors who rely on monthly support after losing a spouse. Policymakers emphasize that these groups usually have limited flexibility when prices rise, and that limited flexibility is exactly why targeted support can matter. There's also a psychological layer that doesn't always get the spotlight. Financial uncertainty creates stress that can affect sleep, health, and overall quality of life, and even the expectation of added support can bring a real sense of relief. Researchers who study retirement repeatedly find that predictability is closely linked to emotional well-being, which is one reason stability is discussed as more than a spreadsheet issue. For years, experts encourage retirees to build emergency savings when possible, but they also acknowledge that many people simply cannot, especially those who face medical challenges, job disruptions, or caregiving responsibilities earlier in life. A supplemental payment can work like a temporary cushion, helping households cover unexpected costs without turning to high-interest debt that can make the next months even harder. This bill also draws attention because it reflects a shifting national conversation about retirement security, with demographic trends showing an aging population and longer life expectancy, meaning benefits often need to stretch further than they did for previous generations. Policymakers increasingly acknowledge that retirement is not a brief pause after work. It can be a substantial chapter of life that requires durable support. The passage of this legislation also underscores the continuing importance of Social Security as a national commitment, built on the idea that workers contribute throughout their careers and receive support later, and moments like this are presented as proof that the system can respond when conditions change. Still, whenever Congress passes a bill involving federal spending, questions about sustainability naturally follow. Supporters argue that targeted measures can exist alongside long-term planning, while critics push for ongoing evaluation to ensure the program stays strong for future retirees, and those debates are part of how policy evolves. But for beneficiaries, the immediate priority is understanding how the near-term changes may affect them and what to do if additional funds arrive. Financial advisors often suggest treating unexpected money with intention. Start with essentials, address overdue bills, rebuild savings that were drained, or cover healthcare needs, because even modest steps can improve resilience. There's something deeply reassuring for many retirees in seeing leaders respond to real lived experiences, because government programs can feel distant and abstract until a measure like this reflects the daily challenges people describe in their own words. When policymakers talk about protecting dignity in retirement, they are tying financial stability to independence. And that connection resonates with older Americans who want to feel their contributions are recognized. Some retirees wonder if an extra payment hints at wider reforms ahead, and while no single bill solves every challenge, it does signal momentum in the ongoing effort to adapt retirement policy to modern realities as economies shift, healthcare evolves, and living costs change. As implementation begins, communication becomes critical, and agencies typically work to provide clear updates so beneficiaries know what to expect and do not spiral into unnecessary worry. Large payment operations require coordination, and a careful rollout can protect accuracy, even if most of that work happens quietly behind the scenes. Aligning systems, confirming eligibility data, and coordinating payment schedules so funds arrive correctly. For couples where both people receive benefits, the added payment can create extra flexibility inside the household budget, and for single retirees, it can provide breathing room that reduces constant financial strain and frees up energy for everyday living. Impact varies by household, but the stated intention stays straightforward: strengthen financial footing for people who feel stretched. It's also worth keeping perspective on how policy decisions are made, because lawmakers often try to balance urgency with responsibility. Move too slowly, and people struggle longer than they should. Move too quickly without planning, and administrative complications can follow. Supporters describe this bill as an attempt to strike that balance, and many officials emphasize respect for the people who built the country through decades of work, reinforcing the idea that retirement should be defined by stability rather than constant financial anxiety. One more thing to keep in mind: passing a bill is only the starting line, not the finish, because implementation is what turns legislation into real-world results. Perhaps the most encouraging part of this development is the reminder that policy can evolve. Programs created generations ago are not frozen, and they can be updated to fit new economic landscapes and emerging needs. The key takeaway remains simple and meaningful. Congress acts, and the focus shifts to delivering additional financial support to Social Security beneficiaries through an extra payment that is designed to be additive, not disruptive. When financial legislation hits the headlines, speculation often follows about what it signals for the future, and some analysts view this as part of a broader recognition that retirement policy must continue evolving as economic landscapes change. At the same time, experts caution against assuming that one measure resolves every question about long-term solvency or benefit design, urging people to see it as one step within an ongoing process rather than a single, all-purpose answer. Policy is rarely one dramatic event. More often, it is a sequence of adjustments shaped by data, experience, and public feedback, and this bill fits that pattern. For retirees, the practical focus stays crystal clear. Understand what the additional funds can do for your household and use them in ways that extend their benefit beyond the moment they arrive, whether that means replenishing savings tapped for emergencies, reducing outstanding balances to make future budgets more manageable, or simply stabilizing essential spending. There is also emotional value in feeling seen by institutions designed to support older Americans. And when legislation acknowledges real world strain, it reinforces the idea that retirees are not navigating economic shifts alone, a reassurance that can matter beyond the dollar amount involved. In the bigger picture, Social Security has long functioned as a promise, a shared commitment that people who contribute during working years will have a measure of protection later in life. And updates like this are presented as evidence that the promise is not static and can respond when circumstances demand attention. Many policymakers describe the measure as practical because it addresses immediate strain, and respectful because it recognizes the lifelong efforts of those who depend on the program. As the rollout advances, clear guidance remains essential so beneficiaries know what to expect, and unnecessary concern does not fill the gaps where information should be. And while large-scale payments naturally require coordination, the stated intent is to deliver support as smoothly as possible. For households planning cycle-to-cycle finances, the extra payment may allow adjustments that were postponed. And for individuals living alone, it can provide reassurance that essential expenses can be met without constant recalculation. Looking ahead, conversations about Social Security funding, demographics, and benefit adequacy continue as part of responsible governance. But the passage of this bill serves as a reminder that action can happen when the need becomes unmistakable. And for many retirees, what matters most is not the political mechanics, but the practical outcome, knowing that help is on the way and that the financial reality so many describe has been acknowledged. Here's what that means in everyday terms. The bill's design leans on the systems beneficiaries already use, because the fastest way to help people is often to avoid reinventing the wheel, and that is why the conversation keeps circling back to existing infrastructure and familiar delivery methods. That also explains why lawmakers talk so much about preventing misunderstandings. When payments change, rumors fill the vacuum, and the most vulnerable targets are often people who are simply trying to keep up with basic expenses. Keep your attention on official notices and verified agency guidance, because the legitimate process typically moves in a straightforward way and does not ask you to hand over personal information to a stranger who contacts you first. Another subtle point is that this supplemental boost is discussed as a bridge, not a permanent redesign. Supporters frame it as a way to shore up buying power when real-world expenses outpace what people expected, while keeping the broader structure intact. And while households will use the funds differently, the logic behind many expert recommendations stays consistent. Cover what keeps you stable, reduce what drains you, and avoid choices that create bigger problems later, especially when high-interest debt can snowball quickly. Even if the extra amount is modest, modest does not mean meaningless, because predictability and a little extra flexibility can reduce the constant mental load of deciding what gets paid first and what must wait. In policy discussions, that mental load shows up indirectly through stories about stretched grocery lists, postponed home repairs, and careful medication choices, all of which underscore why lawmakers argue that targeted support can have outsized impact. And for people who rely on survivor or disability payments, the stakes can feel even sharper, because the room to adjust spending is often limited, and the safety net is not an abstract concept. It is the plan. Supporters also emphasize that protecting accuracy is part of protecting dignity, which is why the rollout is expected to be coordinated rather than chaotic, even if most of the work happens out of view. Finally, keep in mind that public policy does not stop at the vote. It continues through administration, oversight, and future adjustments, and that ongoing process is exactly what analysts point to when they say retirement policy evolves through a series of steps. Taken together, the message is direct. An additive payment is authorized, the intent is efficient delivery through familiar channels, and the broader aim is steadier footing for the people who depend on Social Security to navigate rising costs with more confidence and less strain. Stay alert for official communications as implementation continues. Remain patient while agencies coordinate distribution, and treat any additional funds with thoughtful planning, because even measured support can create real breathing room and help households move forward with greater assurance. Char count 18539.